Okay, great, thank you. On behalf of the ACRL Instruction Section's Inclusive Pedagogies Committee, welcome to today's webinar, Inclusive Pedagogies in Practice, in which we will hear from some of the editors and chapter authors of the upcoming ACRL publication, Exploring Inclusive and Equitable Pedagogies, Creating Space for All Learners. We structured our time together today to model a lightning talk session. So we will first hear from two of the editors of the book for some general framing and background, and then four of the authors will present on their chapters. And then we'll finally end today with an audience question and answer session. So you can feel free to put your questions in the chat throughout the time. We'll be monitoring that, and you can also put questions in at the end. So I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. So first we'll have our two co-editors. Maura Seal is the history librarian at the University of Michigan, and Jane Nichols is the teaching and researcher services librarian at Oregon State University. And then in our authors, in order of their presentations, are Angie Brunk, the academic services librarian at Kansas State University, Clenitra Stewart Nadel, head of professional development and research services librarian at the Alan Queener Massey Law Library at Vanderbilt Law School, Darren Eilert, the teaching and outreach librarian at University of Northern Colorado, and Heather Campbell, curricular librarian at Western University in Ontario, Canada. Welcome to all of our presenters, and thank you so much for your time today. And I will now pass it on to Maura and Jane to get us started.
Jane's getting us started.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for having us, and thank you so much for being here today. We know that it's a very busy time for all of us, and you'll hear some nerves in my voice, so we'll just keep walking through. My face might turn red too, so very par for the course. Anyway, focusing on this book, this has been a really wonderful project. And we started out doing this book because it came out of the ACRL Student Learning and Information Literacy Committee. That committee asked the sub-team called the Publications Team, to think about how we can help meet the ACRL Plan for Excellence goal of advancing equitable and inclusive pedagogical practices and environments for libraries to support student learning. And so we were interested to identify opportunities to produce relevant and timely publications that can work towards that overarching goal. And we created a specific action item to develop a proposal for an ACRL edited book to address the issue of equitable and inclusive pedagogy. And then the people on the team were Robin Brown, Maura Seal, Melissa Mallon, myself. And then we wanted to expand our perspectives, and the committee, and we extended the committee to include Ariana Santiago and Elizabeth Foster. So with that, we began this task. And as we started out, of course, we were reading other literature. And if you're not familiar with Teaching for Justice by Cook and Sweeney, please do familiarize yourself with that wonderful edited collection. The subtitle being Implementing Social Justice in the LIS Classroom. And towards the end, they issue a challenge for us to be the instructors our students need. And I, felt very called by that, and felt like our volume could pick that challenge up and start walking down that pathway. So there's several other other works that bolster and sort of situate this work within that overarching body of work, such as Jorge Lopez McKnight, who I think I saw in the room, and Sophia Long, their Knowledge Justice book, Pogowski and McElroy's Critical Library Pedagogy, handbook, their 2-volume series, the library juice series. They have multiple publications, including a volume that Maura has co-edited, and multiple other articles to draw on. And so we hope that this would continue to build out space for us as a field and a profession to come together and share how we are lifting the veil of white supremacy culture to see with new eyes how we can enact inclusive and equitable pedagogies in our daily work. So for me individually, I had attended the 2018 ACRL Symposium for Strategic Leadership in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And in that symposium, it had come out that our field hasn't changed in 20 years. And so that's the course of my career as a librarian. And that really hit me hard. And I felt like, I wanted to devote more time to changing our profession. And so this was one concrete way to help advance these goals. Maura?
Sure. And next slide, please. So also just sort of approaching our work in new and different ways. Many of us are moving from wanting to just learn about diversity to more sort of fully embodying it in our practices. And then sort of Jane was talking about personal motivations. So I had actually taken a couple of inclusive teaching workshops at my institution through the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching. And I know I only do one-shots, but I was really impressed and interested in how well so many of the strategies in this workshop actually mapped on to doing one-shots. Like they were small interventions, easily done. And I just liked the idea of this idea more. Let me make sure I'm not missing anything in my notes here. Oh, and it was funny because the presenter for these workshops, like that's all she does is one shots. So she was really able to speak to librarians in a very helpful and productive way. Also, just in general, this aligns with a lot of topics I've been thinking about for a while. Like I'm very interested in critical pedagogy and things like that. So next slide, please. Thank you. Thank you, slide wizard. So I just wanted to talk then a little bit about the process of editing the book. So the first thing is we were all extremely conscious and aware of the fact that we were pursuing this project during a global pandemic. And we explicitly committed ourselves to giving both ourselves as editors and the authors flexibility, time, space to do this work. We tried to be very generous with timelines and deadlines and just sort of organically go with how people were feeling and what they were able to do in the moment. We also made that very, very clear in our call for proposals, which I have in my notes here, like that's an inclusive practice, so that's good. And after talking with ACRL Press, we realized we could actually accept most of the proposals that we received. We received a lot of proposals for the book. ACRL Press was open to a 2-volume set and sort of just said, like, we'll figure it out. Like, do what you're gonna do, and then we'll figure it out later. So we did end up accepting most of the proposals, except for those that weren't sort of explicit about how they connected to the topic of the book. We did, and as with all edited collections, like we did have a few people unable to complete their proposed chapters, but that always happens. I don't even think for my previous edited book, I don't even think it was like as bad as that one. Like I feel like I had more people drop out, and that was not during a global pandemic, which is cool. Like you gotta take care of yourself first. The editors as a group, we strove for an equitable editing process. So each editor was primary editor on the same number of chapters. I think that was 5 or 6, and then secondary editor on the same number of chapters. Primary editors, we decided, would be responsible for communicating with the authors that they were editing. We committed to doing developmental editing if authors needed it. So we weren't going to just toss a chapter out. We really worked to improve it, to make sure we could add it. And I think we did that with basically everything. In terms of the structure of the book, so when we accepted all of these proposals, we sort of agreed that we weren't sort of accepting like this many for this topic and this many for that topic. We thought we would accept and sort of figure out later how things sort of fit together, how we would group them by section. So we had sort of an emergent approach to the chapters and the sections in the book. So yeah, so those connections really came through, like that worked out really well, I think. So for each section, we had one editor draft an introduction, and then one editor actually wrote 2 introductions for shorter sections. So as it stands now, we have 43 chapters across 7 sections. So it's a big book. Trying to think if I missed anything. I don't think so. So next slide is just thank you, and hand it along to our authors, who I'm excited to hear from.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm Angie Brunk, and why did I decide to tell my story? So next slide, please. You know, why should you listen to me? So I was born with a visual impairment. I'm considered low vision. That is to say, I'm still a very visual person, but I definitely do experience barriers and, yes, discrimination. I'm a longtime public services librarian, and I've taught at multiple levels. I've taught one-shots, I've taught for credit classes, both as a librarian and as an adjunct instructor in journalism. And then I returned to grad school in my 40s for a 3rd master's degree in human factors and usability testing. And I specialized in accessible and inclusive design for that. So that alone certainly gives you a different perspective on education to return as a student when you have been an active instructor for a number of years. Next, please. I think my story matters because I've experienced the realities of education as a disabled person from both sides of the curtain. And over a fairly long period of time, I mean, I started my higher ed journey in the fall of 1993. At that point, the ADA was barely 3 years old. While there are a lot older laws pertaining to education and accessibility, the awareness that disabled people should have a place in society was newer than we would like to think in 1993. We still have a lot of work to do. I'm not going to say that without offering some evidence and a little bit of a personal story to color that. Like I said, I returned to grad school in my 40s. And by that point, like a lot of middle-aged women, I'd had my wings broken enough that I started flying around on a broomstick. And I was accepted as a student to present at a major human factors conference. And as a student, I had access to travel funds that ironically I didn't as a librarian at that institution. I went to fill out the forms for that and they were terrible. They weren't accessible. And so I got in touch with our Student Access Center coordinator and said, hey, Mike, you know, I really can't do these forms. And we discussed it with a couple of people. And I said, you know, how about I just put the information that would go on the forms in a Word document and I'll attach it to the forms. Easy solution, no fuss, no muss, right? So I told the department chair what the problem was and what I was doing when I asked for his signature. The next thing I know, my boss, the director of the library, is in my office telling me that I shouldn't be alienating people when I'm doing my advocacy. And my first thought was, what? So I emailed Mike to figure out what was going on. Long story short, that particular professor had emailed my boss, the vice president for student affairs, and the Accessibility Resource Center coordinator to complain that I had a bad attitude about my disability and that I was exhibiting a bad attitude. And my first thought was, I think I come off as pretty tough and as someone who, if you have a modicum of sense, you're not going to see as a good victim or a good target. If he's doing that to me, and let me remind you, this is 2017. If he's doing that to me, what is he doing to our disabled students who are more vulnerable? And that particular faculty member did in fact have a history of trying to refuse accommodations and trying to say he didn't like having a sign language interpreter in his class because that distracted from him. And so unfortunately, we still have a lot of work to do. I think having that lived and learned perspective is also very valuable for trying to move the conversation forward and trying to actually move past good intentions on accessibility towards actual good actions. Next, please. You know, I can't give away my whole chapter now because I do want you to read the book, but let's talk about some higher level things that I really wish people understood. Disability is not a binary. And in fact, especially when we're looking at traditional aged undergraduates, or maybe someone who's returning to university to retool their career, sometimes that is because of emergent disability necessitating a professional change. And as people grapple with disability and or become more disabled, you know, the actions, the choices they make might not make sense to you, but frankly, that doesn't matter. And especially in these situations I've outlined, students are often struggling how to figure out how their professional identity and their disability are going to work together, and what are the implications of their disability for their professional identity. In general, disability is a complex interaction between our bodies, our minds, and the outside world that is designed, frankly, for a very cisgendered, heteronormative, and perceived able-bodied and male individual. And in fact, that's discussed quite a lot in human factors and in UX, that we have a lot of UX debt that needs to be worked off. And lastly, and this is a hill I will die on, so somebody feel free to bring me a sword, library instruction is library marketing. We can't get everything through in our classes, in our one-shots. The most important thing we can get through in a one-shot is that students should feel welcome and comfortable in the library. And if we're not paying attention to accessibility, we can actually unintentionally alienate these students. Next, please. There are a few different models for how we look at disability. I am not a big fan of the charity model. I am not your charity case. I am a functional professional, and most disabled people have the capacity to act as independent actors and should do so. The medical model tends to treat people as something to be fixed, and that is not always the case. The social justice model best fits with libraries, where we're trying to meet users where they're at and to also fix systems that are broken, not people. People aren't broken, they're different, but they're not broken. Next, please. We have to think about priorities. Accessibility, if we're going to execute it well, accessibility has to be a priority And it has to be defined as a priority and treated as a priority. That means that somebody needs to actually be accountable. Somebody needs to have responsibility. If everybody's in charge, nobody's in charge. Somebody needs to step up to the plate and take that responsibility for saying, I am going to lead the charge for us having accessible instruction. Something's got to give. We cannot do everything. Librarians have a propensity to reinvent the wheel and to think that we have to rebrand everything with our university or our institution. Producing content takes time. Producing accessible content takes more time. So we have to think about how we prioritize what gets done and judicious reuse of content. I've started doing some work with the New Literacies Alliance because I'm at K-State where a lot of the work on that is done. And, you know, they do care about accessibility. Please reuse our tutorials. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Next, please. There are a lot of gray areas in accessibility. And I gotta say, compassion versus tough love is one of them. For the love of all that it's holy and unholy, please don't fight against official accommodations. Students had to work hard to get those, for one thing. For another, just don't. And unfortunately, I do have to say that. Disabled students have got to learn from failure as well. I've certainly had to fail. And I think almost all of us have. And I've had to learn certain lessons the hard way about, you know, not waiting till the last minute. The fact that someone has a disability doesn't change the fact that sometimes tough love is the right course of action. And quite honestly, the real world is not going to be kind to you. And we don't do our students any favors when we act as if it will. And resilience, like positivity, can become a toxic trait. Disabled people have to cultivate resilience more than most, but I have seen it become toxic. And, you know, when we are thinking about our interaction with students, we need to bear these things in mind. At the same time, there is a very, very strong role for compassion. And when you can bend the rules, especially if you are bending them to accommodate a disability, why not? Next, please. And I have much more detail on this in my chapter. When you're thinking about library instruction, especially when you're thinking about designing cool, fun activities, please use task analysis. That is to say, breaking a task down to its simplest steps so that you understand the physical, emotional, and cognitive demands of a particular task. So think about what's involved, say, in playing a hand of your favorite card game or, you know, your favorite simple game. And how could you modify that activity for someone with various cognitive and physical impairments that you're likely to encounter in a university setting? And apply that thinking to your instruction activities so that you're prepared, because unfortunately you will find out the hard way at the last second, so that you're prepared to help that student who shows up in your instruction session where you've planned to take students to that one part of your library, and a lot of libraries have them, that isn't wheelchair accessible, and so that you're prepared to gracefully move away from that plan into a plan that accommodates all of your learners, and do so while preserving the student's dignity and autonomy. Next slide, please. More importantly, here is my contact information. I am happy to serve as a resource. In fact, that's probably the single greatest impact I can have on the profession, is helping those who are sincerely interested in improving accessibility. So please do not hesitate to get in touch with me. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Clincher Stewart-Nadel from Vanderbilt Law Library, and I'll be talking about DEIA and cultural competence for law students with legal research instruction. Next slide, please. My chapter is entitled Better Learning Through Legal Research, Increasing Law Students' Cultural Competency and Awareness of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Using Legal Research Instruction. Just very briefly today, I'm going to touch on three things. One, the purpose of teaching DEIA and cultural competence to law students in legal education. Two, the importance of legal research instruction in doing that. And then three, consideration for incorporating DEIA related issues and cultural competence issues in legal research instruction. Next slide, please. All right, so talking about legal education. Next slide. The typical law school program is 3 years, and that's post-college. There are various programs that are part-time or night programs, but generally students are in law school for 3 years, learning about how to analyze clients' issues, the laws, and understanding the client's background. And a lot of those considerations include legal ethics, what the client's cultural norms are, their expectations, and of course, their backgrounds and experiences. Next slide, please. Now, the ABA has standards and rules for the approval of law schools that govern how law schools work. And as of February 2022, there's a new requirement that law schools have to provide education twice during the law student's career, once at the beginning, and then at another point in the 3 years on bias, cross-cultural competency, and racism. And so as a law librarian thinking about how to promote this and how to help with this, courses that incorporate these topics are included in meeting this requirement. Next slide, please. Legal research instruction is also required by the standards and rules for law schools, and they can be in a variety of formats. Sometimes it's standalone courses, sometimes it's combined with legal writing courses or workshops, or even just one-off or one-on-one research instruction. Next slide, please. So combining that with thinking about how law students need to understand DEIA and cultural competence is important. Next slide, please. So diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility with regards to law students is really tied to relating to those clients and then understanding when the law itself, while it might seem neutral on its face, is actually negatively impacting those from diverse backgrounds. For cultural competence in law, it's best been described as having the capacity to provide effective legal assistance that's grounded in an awareness of and sensitivity to diverse cultures. When you think about the fact that we're going to lawyers to help us with our legal issues, to protect our rights, the idea that a lawyer wouldn't understand the DEIA issues and the cultural competence issues that are associated with that is a little frightening. And so that's part of what we as law librarians are trying to do to educate law students. Next slide, please. So thinking about legal research instruction specifically, there are a couple of considerations. Next slide, please. For legal research, and the perfect quote for this is, it presents the perfect opportunity to introduce students to concepts of diversity, contextualized with the framework of learning how to be a lawyer. There's a couple of reasons why legal research specifically is good for this. As a skills course, it's experiential and also interactive in a way that doctrinal courses are not. There's also more direct interaction with the instructor. For a constitutional law class or a property law class, there may be a class of 80 students listening to a lecture, but with legal research courses, there tend to be a much smaller number of students that are interacting with each other and interacting with the instructor on a regular basis. It also provides the ability to identify and analyze specific laws of our choosing that we can help students understand DEIA issues and cultural competence using those tasks. And the detailed level of the research exercises and sources provides a sort of immersive experience and a very strong analytical experience for the students. Next slide, please. Key considerations when doing this, first of all, you need to decide the extent to which DEIA and cultural competence will be integrated into that course or that session. Every single issue that you discuss during that course or that session need not relate to DEIA and cultural competence, but there are opportunities that can be taken advantage of to incorporate those issues to help better educate the students. In doing that, it's going to be important to create session guidelines or even a full course or session syllabus that lays out the ground rules for having discussions of this sensitive nature. And this ties really to the class management piece of it. Diversifying existing legal research exercises and assignments is going to be important. No one has time to reinvent the wheel, but if you're thinking of an assignment where students have to analyze a specific law, why not use a law that's going to incorporate these issues, like a housing discrimination or accessibility law or an employment discrimination law? Carefully deciding what sort of exercises you're going to use is helpful in doing this and helps you to use the time that you have with them in the most effective way to promote DEI awareness and to promote cultural competence. Next slide, please. There's also the need to prepare for appropriately managing class discussions. You've laid the ground rules in your session guidelines or syllabus, and then you'd have to follow through with making sure that those conversations in the class are handled sensitively and well, and that students respect each other and boundaries. Also, soliciting feedback from students is important to understand what went well in the session or course, what did not go well, not just with the instruction, but also with the piece that does include the DEIA and the cultural competence aspect. And then, of course, remembering the need for administrative buy-in, whether that's from a director or from a student affairs office or an academic affairs office, but making sure that that buy-in is there from the beginning helps make the process that much smoother. And so my chapter essentially discusses this and how law students can benefit from this. Thank you for the opportunity to talk today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Darren Eilert, and I'm the Teaching and Outreach Librarian at the University of Northern Colorado. And my talk today is about a change in my teaching, namely learning to put people first, cultural humility, funds of knowledge, and information literacy instruction with first-generation students. So next slide, please. First of all, some background information. In 2017, I was hired to work with 2 federally funded TRIO programs that serve first-generation and low-income students, most of whom are also BIPOC students, that is Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I teach a credit course for one program and 3 one-shots for another, but I also have a lot of other contacts with them. I go to their presentations, I have an office hour, etc. So how I used to teach was really a problem. I felt like I had to show mastery of information literacy content and classroom management skills. And so I tried to catch bad behavior and to correct it. So if students were distracted by their phones, missing class, or not turning in work, so they were just acting like human beings, right? I thought I was a bad teacher. And so I was making it all about me. And because I have mostly privileged identities, I had the privilege of not thinking about things like race, socioeconomic status, and power that were at play in the classroom. However, those factors were at the forefront of my students' minds because they've experienced histories of abuse in education, and that abuse continues till today. And I was actually a part of that history. So I was a part of the problem causing students harm. So a really bad picture, actually. Fortunately, I had a few really brave students who trusted me enough to give me an invaluable gift. And those were some key learning moments for me. And what they did is they told me that I was causing them harm. And so I'm very thankful to them for that. And so these key learning moments shook me up and have helped me start to change how I teach. And it's going to be a lifelong project. So next slide, please. So that was background information. I'm going to talk about 2 theories very briefly that helped me make this change. One is cultural humility. So this is a term that was coined by Tervalon and Murray Garcia in 1998 in the context of medical training. So that's training nurses and doctors. And it has since spread to other fields, including counseling, education, and librarianship. So Tervalon and Murray Garcia suggest moving away from a very narrow understanding of cultural competence. So they're critiquing a particular type of cultural competence where people think, I've learned everything I need to know, I can check off the box and I can move on. So they're critiquing that, and they posit a new term for, at that time, cultural competence. It has several features, and I'm going to talk about some of those here. The first is a set of affective aspects, and I'm only going to talk about a couple of those. You might think that humility means self-deprecation, but that's not the case. Instead, it's more of openness to how culture shows up in an interaction. And you can't know ahead of time how it will show up, but an openness to that. Second, it requires addressing power imbalances. So we inherently have power in the classroom, either in one-shots or as instructors of record. And we need to address that imbalance. Third, it requires learning about one's own cultures and biases and social scripts and how those show up in the classroom. And finally, it entails relationship building with students. And so next slide, please. So now the other theory that I think goes very well with cultural humility is funds of knowledge. And so this comes from elementary education and working with Latinx families. And I'll just mention the book by Gonzalez and colleagues from 2005 called Funds of Knowledge. And there they talk about funds of knowledge as the fact that students bring valid and valuable knowledge and skills that they gain from their families, their communities, their workplaces, and their previous education. They bring those to the classroom. And far from being an obstacle to learning, they are great foundations for learning in education, in formal education. And then later, Marquez Quillama and Rios Aguilar wrote a book about funds of knowledge in the higher education context, and I highly recommend both of those. I feel a funds of knowledge approach can help put cultural humility into practice. I think they go well together. So the next slide is about the classroom practice. How do I do this? So the main change I'd like to highlight is I used to worry about catching bad behavior, right? What I understood as bad behavior, but really was a result of all the stresses that students are facing in their lives, right? They have full lives outside of college. So I used to think about catching bad behavior, and I worried about covering all the content. Those were bad practices. And now I put people first by demonstrating care and interest about their lives. So here are a few examples of what I do. We negotiate course policies together. So for the credit courses, using Padlet, so it's anonymous, they give me their input on how late work policy should look or attendance policy, things like that. And this helps address the power imbalance in the classroom and gives them a voice. Second, students suggest a topic, and then we vote on topics like in a March Madness style bracket to decide on the example topic in the course. And then they serve as expert consultants on the topic, and we develop it together, come up with a research question and look for sources. And then they apply those skills to their own research project that's, their own choice of topic. Third, students dedicate class sessions to family, friends, former teachers, coaches, etc., anyone who has inspired them and supported them. And this honors their families and their communities, and it helps bridge the gap between home cultures and campus culture, which can often be a problem for, or a source of tension for first generation students. And then fourth, I build in time for students to check in on each other, and I give them prompts. So what are some study skills that you can share with each other? How are you doing at this point in the semester? What are some, how are you taking care of yourself? So self-care, and that helps build community in the classroom. And then fifth, I encourage students to pursue research based on their lived experiences. And this validates their funds of knowledge, and it draws on them as valid research topics, and it increases motivation and relevance. And then another thing I don't have on the slide is that I have them complete a confidential online survey, and I ask about their lives, their interests, their other commitments. And this shows that I want to know about them, and that and it helps me support them later in the course if I need to. And also, by the way, I never ask students to share anything that I don't share myself as well. Okay, next slide, please. Last thing is about staying accountable. This is an important part of cultural humility. Well, I do this both individually and as part of a community. One way is that I do reflective journaling, and I try to examine my biases there, reflect on my choices in the classroom and how they might be impacting students, and challenge myself to try new things. In my department, which I think of as a learning community, we also do peer observation and give each other feedback on DEI issues. And we visit each other's classes the last day of class and do verbal feedback in addition to formal course evaluation. So we're getting student input as well. And then we have monthly development meetings where we take turns choosing and leading discussion on readings related to DEI issues in teaching. Next slide, please. This is my last slide, and it has a QR code for a selected bibliography, and it has my email. And thank you for attending today, and I welcome questions and comments. Thank you.
Darren, I'm excited for us to chat later because there's lots of connections between your chapter and mine. So I join you today from the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinantan peoples, where I am an uninvited settler. My chapter describes one university's experience using feminist pedagogy to design an institutional initiative rather than a course or a lesson. Feminist classrooms are often described as personal, empowering, and inclusive, and they foster students' commitment to social justice. Feminist teachers give students a lot of choice and flexibility with how and what they learn, often relying heavily on discussion and reflection. We wanted a mandatory first-year course that introduced students to academic research while also building community between each section as a cohort. But at such a scale, we had logistical implications that would impact a feminist design. We had a finite number of instructors, classrooms to put them in, and only one teaching librarian. So how might feminist pedagogy work at such an institutional scale? So next slide, please. Before I continue, a little context. This chapter describes the work of Brescia University, which is Canada's only remaining women's university. This is where I worked until the fall of 2020. Brescia was founded by the Ursuline Sisters in 1919. They're a teaching order committed to social justice, community service, and the development of women. A project like this was possible because Brescia's mission, culture, and degree level learning outcomes are directly aligned with an Ursuline philosophy. Brescia is also very small, so there's only 400 first-year students there annually. So while our first-year seminar was supposed to support students with academic research and information literacy, we also wanted to introduce students to Brescia's values-based degree outcomes you can see on the screen. So Ursuline philosophy tells us we need to teach students to know themselves and their unique strengths, help others to do the same. We need to teach students to work together in community in pursuit of social justice and recognize where we each still need to learn. So it might come as a surprise then that a women's university like Brescia had never labeled itself feminist before. And it took my librarian colleague, Jenny Foley, to really awaken the college to its feminist foundation. In my chapter, I describe the pilot courses that came before our feminist version and the reasons why they didn't quite work. Ultimately, it was because the very thing that makes Brescia unique was missing from the course. Once we started to dig into feminist pedagogies, thanks to Jenny, the connections with Ursuline philosophy were almost embarrassingly obvious. I'll invite you to, go ahead with next slide. I'll invite you to read the chapter for a more thorough description of the course itself. The most recognizably feminist elements included its social justice oriented theme. In the first year, it was living in a fractured world. But it also had a pass-fail assessment model, emphasis on values exploration and use of class discussions. And I think most significantly, students were given a lot of agency, like we heard from Darren, to help build course content. IL and an introduction to academic research were a major focus of the course's assignments, but this was integrated with students' personal reflections and the team project. Today, though, I want to focus the rest of my time on how we approached building this course from behind the scenes, including the library's involvement and the lessons I learned along the way. So next slide. Go ahead with the next slide. Yeah, perfect. I think the most important decision we made was in forming a collaborative cross-institutional course team. Each member took on a specific leadership responsibility. By this point, I'll share that I moved from the library to the Teaching and Learning Center. So I served as the educational developer that oversaw this team approach. We then organized the course through weekly meetings held nearly year-round. These meetings were always attended by a core group, which was the instructors, myself, and our librarian, and then other staff attended as needed. In the summer, meetings took a train-the-trainer approach, usually with a broad range of colleagues leading us through their area of expertise as it related to the course. And then during the academic year, weekly meetings shifted to a community of practice model with time for reflection on from the previous week, and we're fighting urgent concerns, lesson planning for the weeks ahead, that sort of thing. So for example, we would have training in the summer with student experience on transition needs of first-year students, but then we could support individual students in crisis during weekly meetings during the school year, and would liaise with academic advisors as needed. I will share the students in the course had largely no idea this was happening behind the scenes, so I'll give the library as an example. Team members on this cross-institutional team were invited to prepare lesson plans, but it was the course instructors delivering that content and providing student feedback a lot of the time. The librarian was one of the only team members to actually guest lecture in the course, but even still, a lot of our IL content was delivered by course instructors. In some ways, this was a logistical decision. We had 14 sections of the course and only one librarian, but it was part of our feminist design as well. We wanted students to build connections with their instructors and each other. And so this meant that during weekly meetings, the librarian was counseling instructors on common research bottlenecks and sometimes giving feedback on how they taught IL. Next slide, please. And this brings me to lessons learned. So in my role as course coordinator, I'll share I needed to fully become a feminist teacher personally to help launch this course. It wasn't a huge stretch, obviously, but using this team-based approach required us to demonstrate trust in each other and a lot of humility, like Darren was talking about, and a constant commitment to our social justice aims. So as much as it felt like an enormous victory to see a mandatory IL course come to fruition, I'd been working on it for over 10 years. IL, I had to recognize, was not more important than the broader course goals. And I had come to see that some of the challenges of the original pilots were in how I was teaching IL. Students had struggled in those sections to see the social justice elements of IL, and it's because I was teaching searching skills. When we used a feminist approach instead, thanks to Jenny, the course elevated students' lived experience to an equal place to academic research. And the focal point of our IL instruction shifted to introducing and sometimes critiquing the place of academic research in a global society. So the second lesson I'll highlight from the chapter is how I learned to recognize university power structures and navigate my way through them. Instructors always have more power in the classroom. That was still the case here because they maintained final say over course content and assignments. But in this team-based model, we'd each been given power to lead our own little corner of the course. And that meant we had to take that power. In such a flexible, high-speed environment, we needed to strongly advocate for our areas of expertise and lead our colleagues with confidence, even though one of them was my dean and my boss. So the feminist design to this course and the team-based model and the emphasis of IL were all because librarians had learned to lead with humility. So next slide, please. I'll share that I conducted some preliminary assessment of the course in its first 2 terms, but like most teaching and learning research, this came to an abrupt halt with the COVID-19 pandemic. We had to redesign the course again, and this time for an online delivery, and that meant my ethics approval was negated. So the preliminary data I share in the course is that nearly all research participants did demonstrate our IL learning outcomes by the end of the course, but interestingly, the library was barely mentioned by study participants at all. So I'll leave you with these reflection questions on the screen. Does it matter who gets the credit for teaching information literacy? Sometimes yes, but who are our learners, especially in a feminist decolonized environment? In my case, in a lot of the cases, it was the faculty colleagues. If we want to teach the relationship between social justice and information literacy, what should partnerships look like for librarians? So thank you so much for your time. I'll make sure to share my contact information in the chat, and I'll turn it back to Liz and everyone else for Q&A.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters for the excellent and very interesting presentations. So we have a little over 10 minutes left in our time together. So now is time for those questions that you've been thinking of along the way. You can put questions directly in the chat and we'll take them from there. Or if it's something a little more complicated, feel free to raise your hand. That's available down in the reactions area on the bottom of your screen. You can raise your hand to ask a question. while folks are thinking of things to put in the chat, I'll go ahead and get us started with a question, which some of you touched on a bit in your presentations already, but I think a question that's really on many of our minds over the last couple of years. But I wonder if you could, some of you could talk about how the pandemic and the shift to online learning has changed or in any way affected the way you approach your inclusive pedagogies.
I think one of the important points that I cannot emphasize enough from the accessibility point of view is that things that people with disabilities have been asking for years and been told no and been told that's not possible, suddenly because of the pandemic became possible. And we need to not lose that energy. And we need to make sure that they remain possible, not be brushed aside when they're no longer convenient.
I can give an update on the course, building on what Angie said, that I'm not at Brescia anymore, but the instructors kept up with that energy, and Angie, and they now are using, they've a flipped model with a podcast. And so I don't think they're going to be going back to like traditional lectures. So students can listen to the class podcast wherever they are, and the students are encouraged to do so while they're like working on the bus, you know, washing dishes. And then so that when they come to class, it's just with their small discussion, and they're like leveraging the pandemic for that regard.
I'll jump in and say that from the perspective of trying to manage classrooms while dealing with sensitive issues related to DEIA, moving online really made me hone my classroom management skills, because the cues that you would rely on, like being able to constantly see someone's face, or even hear the tone of their voice because cameras may be off for various reasons, they're not necessarily there for you. So I found that the pandemic really helped me to hone those skills that I needed.
And I'll just add that I feel like it just turned the volume up on my ability to put people first, right? It made it more obvious that I needed to do that. And so we had one course that was supposed to be in person at Spring 21, and several students said, well, yours is the only course that's in person, and I have to spend $6,000 to live on campus. I could save that money if I lived at home. And so we made it hybrid, right? You need to accommodate people and look at their whole situation, and yeah, think of them as more than just students, right? And so I think the pandemic just put that into stronger relief. Yeah.
And Maura and Jane, I realize you're the editors. You didn't talk specifically about your own work. You talked more about the book, but I'm sure folks would be interested to hear anything either of you has to share to you.
Just in some ways, like I did a lot of, I think we all did, like a lot of instruction sections on Zoom. And I really appreciated like how it allowed for students to engage in different ways, like in the chat, for example. And as someone who was like terrified to speak as an undergrad, if I had that, I would have been so much more, participated so much more in classes, because like it was so much less intimidating to me to like write something down. So just sort of being attuned to like other ways of participating, and trying to sort of bring those even in now, like when I do in-person stuff, like I sometimes ask students to write something instead. And then they can share if they want, but they don't have to, but all of them write something.
We do have a question in the chat, so I'll just go ahead and read that out. So Nadia asks, as you were designing your own inclusive pedagogies, was there a particular guiding tool or tools that were most helpful to you? We mentioned that they work with a team putting together an inclusive pedagogy toolkit they hope to develop to debut at ALA Annual. So any tools that you all have found useful in your work?
I'll say that I've made great use of our Center for Teaching, and I know a lot of universities have something similar. They've been very helpful with making sure that there's the accessibility issues are covered, making sure that we're considering the issues that we should be considering. So I consider them probably one of the best resources I have right now.
For me, the biggest tool was longstanding relationships. As somebody who served on accessibility committees at several different universities and has worked with a variety of students, my lived experience is important, but having candid conversations about the realities of certain classroom models and about how does this affect a person's lived reality when they use a wheelchair or when they can't hear has been a tremendous guide in trying to develop something that I think is useful for everybody.
One of the tools I found, particularly for cultural humility, where one of the aspects is examining your own biases and scripts that you play out in the classroom. I forget the exact, I have to look for the link, but there's a famous Harvard website where you can do tests to see about your own implicit biases and there's multiple of them based on different identities, and it's humbling and important to become aware of things that you're otherwise that are otherwise sort of unconscious.
Erin, we're on the same wavelength today. I was going to talk about the flower of power was really influential for us, but the most was honestly digging into theory, feminist theory. Bell Hooks and Sarah Ahmed, I would say, were most influential for our project because, like with the team model, we could then reflect on how that, the reading impacted and related to us.
I was going to say I didn't have a particular tool, but theory and books about theory came to mind. And so I have to my left my handouts, or not handouts, my show and tell of books. And the other one that a lot of folks drew on was Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo. And I have Bell Hooks' book here as well. So yeah, I just wanted to call those out.
So I think we're at the end of our time together. So I've seen some comments in the chat, and I know that I agree that this makes me very excited to get the book, for the book to come out eventually. Again, thank you so much for sharing, and thank you to everyone for attending. With that, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.